There have been, this is the fourth impeachment episode in American history. Let me just briefly tell you about the others. But as I was thinking about my comments today, I realized that each of the previous episodes came at a great change moment in American history. We can't know what this change moment means, but looking back at the others, as I'll show you in a minute, it's really quite striking. So, first, the first president to be impeached was Andrew Johnson, who is my candidate for the worst president in American history. Easy, hands down. He was a terrible racist. He thought that African Americans had no business claiming equality with white people. He thought there was no business having African Americans vote. And he is the president right at the end of the Civil War. Lincoln puts him on the ticket because he was from Tennessee and a Democrat. So what better way to show that the country is reunited than to take a Southern Democrat and put him on the Republican ticket? They changed the name of the party even. But it turns out the man really had a deep racist urge within him. So just imagine. The Republican Congress, absolutely dominated by Republicans, has just fought this war. 750,000 people had died. 200,000 black men have fought in the Civil War. The Army's only 1 million. So at the end, African-American soldiers are key to the victory, key to actually populating an army that is just being ground down. That's partially how they beat the Confederates. Confederates ran out of people. In fact, at the very end, the Confederates were actually trying to draft slaves into their army. It was something that completely refuted the idea of the Confederacy. The Republicans at this point have an idea of true liberation of African Americans. And they know what that means is giving people some form of livelihood. So one of the things they start to do is order the Freedmen's Bureau that's supposed to make the change into, from war to reconstructing the South, to give plots of land to the former slaves, often the plots of land where they were slaves, and let them own a little bit of land where they can farm for themselves. And Johnson absolutely refused to carry out this policy. Indeed, he ordered the army to drive those people off the land. In several cases, high-ranking officers, heroes of the Civil War, resigned their commission rather than go and tell a group of recently freed men and women, no, get off this land, we're going to find whoever it was that it now belongs to and give it back to them. Indeed, the 13th Amendment that freed the slaves has a loophole. That loophole says there'll be no slavery, quote, except as punishment for crimes. So in our Constitution, you may still have slavery as punishment for crimes. And the South was all over that. So create black codes, say that if you don't have a slip of paper saying you are allowed to be walking down the street, you're arrested. And back into slavery you go. Johnson thought that was fine. So the Republicans are going crazy in Congress, and they make a trap. They say you may no longer knock off officials. You cannot force them to resign. You cannot fire them. Imagine if Trump had this requirement on him. You can no longer force people to resign or fire them. The Tenure of Office Act, it was called. Johnson says, screw you. Well, of course, the Constitution says they can fire people. The Constitution's ambiguous. Immediately fires Stanton, the Secretary of War, and boom, they impeach him. It's a very close call, but by one vote, 35 say that he should be removed in the Senate, 19 say don't remove. That's one vote short of removal, and so Johnson survives. The truth of the matter is what they tried to get him on, he was probably right. The Supreme Court later ruled in his favor. What the real object of their ire was how he was overruling the effort to reconstruct the South and give African Americans newly freed from slavery a chance. That's what the real point was. There's one whole problem, and it's going to sound very familiar. What Johnson stood for, all Democrats stood for. There were 10 Democrats in the Senate at the time. They all voted for him on all three provisions. The Democrats were the party of slavery, and they were the party of white supremacy. And so when Johnson said things like, we can't give votes to African Americans, that's ridiculous, the whites would revolt, the Democrats agreed. They all voted against the Civil War amendments and so forth. So here we have a case, great turning moment in American history, the moment that African Americans are brought out from slavery and the effort to reconstruct our society as a multiracial society. But the impeachment really reflects the parties and what they believe, with the Republicans pushing for equality and liberation, and the Democrats pushing for a return to white supremacy. All right, the next one is Richard Nixon. So a century goes by, no more impeachments. And then we have the Richard Nixon, and this is a change moment because Nixon follows complete Democratic dominance. 7 out of the 9 last presidential elections, Democrats win. And the one exception, Dwight Eisenhower, was a kind of Democrat light. The conservatives really didn't like Dwight Eisenhower. He agreed to the New Deal. Nixon comes along, squeaks by in 68, and in 72, after this long run of Democrats, he wins 49 states. Something has changed, and it's dramatic. And indeed, looking back in history, we see that was it for the Democrats. Republicans, the Democrats, putting aside the Watergate election, over the next 5 elections are going to average 76 electoral college votes. 76 on average. By the way, there's 538 electoral college votes. They got slaughtered. Nixon is the tipping point, but we didn't know that then. I'm just suggesting something was in the air. So what does he do? He does a third-rate burglary, this stupid thing. The guy wins 49 states. The last thing he needs to do is break into the Democratic National Headquarters, and then he's caught on tape saying, I want you to stonewall it. And so he is not yet impeached, but impeachment is in the air. And the thing that really got him was what was on the tapes. So the White House tapes, which Kennedy started, Lyndon Johnson used, so that we could have a little historical record of the presidents. And those tapes, when they were released, hit the country like a pie in the face. Nixon used to come off as sort of the second coming of Mike Pence. I guess it would have to be the first coming. Holier than thou. I'm sorry if they're Mike Pence, but you know how he is. Completely upright. And he's always talking about, that's the wrong thing to do. He's trying to be holier than thou. And then, excuse me, but I'm just going to quote the tapes. Every second word was shit or fuck. And so here these tapes hit, and everybody thinks, the guy is the biggest phony. Imagine if Mike Pence is released on tapes using the N-word, using the J-word, and the S-word, and the F-word. He couldn't write a sentence, finish a sentence without an S or an F. So as soon as those tapes become public, his public opinion ratings go bam, and everybody runs for cover because it turns out the guy's a thug. So yes, he was guilty. No, Johnson wasn't guilty of the offense that he was charged with. But yes, Nixon was guilty. But you have to understand, it wasn't like people weighed guilty or innocent. They saw a guy who was holier than thou, and they saw that he was behaving like a thug. And I think that really changed the dynamics. So just remember that when people talk about the Nixon impeachment, it was his behavior. It was his hypocrisy. It would be like Trump speaking in an English accent, talking about the deplorables who vote for him and chuckling about it. That's how dramatic it was in the day. And that was Richard Nixon. We never got to impeachment because a group of Republican senators headed by Barry Goldwater went to the White House and said, Dick, you're done. And off he went. The third and my last, so I'm almost done, is Bill Clinton. And many of you, of course, will remember Bill Clinton. Another change moment. The Republicans have absolutely dominated the presidency. Poor Michael Dukakis, who was in the last election, 1988, he won, what, 6 states in the District of Columbia, something like that. Bill Clinton comes along and he picks the Republican lock. And now looking back on it, we realize since then, 1992, the Republicans have gotten a majority once in the presidential vote. Now, they've won a lot of elections, but only because of the Electoral College. So something big was changing from complete Republican dominance to a Democratic dominance in the popular vote. Bill Clinton is got, let's just say, sexual trouble from the day he starts. He almost loses New Hampshire, does lose New Hampshire because of a woman named Jennifer Flowers. He is pressed by a woman named Paula Jones. He is, of course, discovered to have had sex with an intern named Monica Lewinsky. It goes on. Today, we wouldn't put up with this, but at the time, Clinton was caught, as Nixon had been, as Johnson had been, in a great storm. Dole announced when Clinton won, and the Republicans were furious, they owned the presidency. And Clinton sort of snuck in with 43% of the vote in a three-way. Dole announced something that was unimaginable by the standards of the day. He said, no matter what he's for, we're going to block him. So there was already a battle going around Clinton, and this was put in the context of that battle. Democrats thought he had been outrageous. Dole had been, just saying he would oppose everything. So Clinton comes forward and says, I didn't have sex with that woman, Monica Lewinsky. Well, the Star prosecutor does a long report, and the report goes into great detail about the sex he had with her. And if you're feeling like you want to really outrage someone, just go and look at that report. I mean, the details in it, because Starr thought it was necessary to actually show exactly the kinds of sex Clinton had. And it kind of comes around to what you consider sex. But most people would say, reading the report, that was sex. But it's a very strange kind of thing for two reasons, and then I'll stop. First reason, we're in the middle of a battle with the Republicans outraged at Clinton all the time. And so the Democrats responding, thinking, Republicans are just going to throw everything at him, and impeachment is just one more thing. And the second was, it was not really about policy. It was about his own personal behavior and what he lied about it. So it was a very personally, you wanted to brush your teeth after every hearing and debate. But the election results were really quite clear. There were two major charges, and both were for acquittal. 50 for acquittal, 45 not, and then 50-50, so nowhere near the two-thirds that they needed. No Democrat voted guilty on any of the charges. And on one charge and the second, Republicans 5 and 10 voted not guilty. So this was a very ambiguous situation then that had to do with the battles of the day. But if somebody was this promiscuous and this possibly violent towards sexuality, by today's standards, it would be outrageous in the Democratic Party. So the Democrats would probably have abandoned Clinton in today's context. Republicans, well, that gets us today's story. So I'll turn to those who know about that. Thank you.
And before we turn to Rich Arenberg, I have a question. And you alluded to this a bit in your comments. So the partisanship that we see on display in the current proceedings, do they differ, substantively or procedurally from the partisanship that was on display during earlier impeachment eras?
So this is the era of highest partisanship, at least back to Andrew Johnson. There's just no overlap in the party. Back in the era of Andrew Johnson, 10 Republicans, 10 conservative Republicans, actually voted to acquit him. There were very radical Republicans. We call them radical, but they wanted equality for African Americans. There were conservative Republicans, and the conservative Republicans were kind of like the more liberal of the Democrats. So there was overlap between the parties. Likewise, in the Clinton era, we're coming to in the Nixon era, lots of liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, lots of overlap. Ditto, in the Clinton era, we're at the very end of overlap between the parties, which is a point I tried to get at. There's one last thing I'll say about the partisanship. So today, two things. One, the sides are just completely apart. The most conservative Democrat is far to the left of the most liberal Republican. First time in American history that's true. And in the past, the identity politics were diffused between the parties. In the past, Republicans stood for freedom and equality for African Americans. And if you were African American, you were a Republican, end of thought. But the Democrats were really good about immigration, really open, and the Republicans were nativists. So we took the identity politics and we split them up. Today, for the first time in American history, starting in the 1990s, we've combined them. The idea that one party has both African Americans and immigrants, and the other party is like, no, 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 white natives, we've never had that. So identity politics goes under policy partisanship. And I believe that's why things are so explosive today.
And for that, we'll now turn to Professor Rich Arenberg for some discussion of the procedures unfolding.
Well, Jim's always a hard act to follow, but he's been talking about sex, and I get to talk about rules and procedures. So,
You got the better end of that part.
but hang in there with me a little bit, and I'll try to pick up and make a connection to really where Jim left off, and that is with the question of how polarized the current environment is, and it's a matter of considerable concern. I mean, we take it for granted, but the fact that all of the pundits, probably everyone up here at the table, most of the media, everyone, for a long time now believes they know exactly how this is going to come out in the United States Senate. That there will be articles of impeachment voted by the House of Representatives, and that the Senate will acquit him. When you step back and think about that, it's really kind of sad, because the Senate plays the role in impeachment of the jury. And if we were looking at a criminal trial and thought before the indictment is even written, before any charges have actually been brought, that we know what the outcome of the jury would be, we'd be very concerned about that. So the contrast with the Nixon impeachment, look, things were pretty polarized by 1998. And yet, as Jim laid out, when the trial got to the Senate, again, it was a very partisan impeachment in the House of Representatives. When it got to the Senate, there was great concern. I was there at the time. There was great concern held by the minority leader, Tom Daschle, but also the majority leader, the Republican Trent Lott. They wanted to be certain that the Senate approached this trial in a fair, deliberative way, in a serious way, and in a way that would protect the dignity of the Senate. And they were successful in doing that, in that they wrote a resolution, both sides, written by Senator Kennedy from Massachusetts and Senator Phil Gramm from Texas, the Republican. They wrote a resolution that would govern the procedures that were going to take place in the Senate. And it was a bipartisan resolution. And in fact, the Senate passed it 100-0. As partisan as the atmosphere was, they established the framework for the trial in a bipartisan way. And as Jim laid out, actually 10 Republicans in the end wound up voting against conviction of President Clinton, really on the charge which most people thought was the easiest one to prove, and that was perjury, because he admitted he'd lied to the grand jury. So let me fast forward now to the current situation, and I'll quickly mention the current process in the House, because it's very straightforward. The House of Representatives is generally very straightforward. It's a majoritarian body. I like to say that if you want to understand the House, all you have to know is who has the keys to the bulldozer. And so the House is what it is. It'll be very straightforward. They passed a resolution to set up the procedure that we're watching unfold now. They passed it on October 31st, and it was by a virtually party line vote. 2 Democrats voted with the Republicans, and one now independent former Republican voted with the Democrats. So it was again a very kind of partisan framework. And, the Republicans have been complaining about the procedures throughout. So quickly, what that procedure will be is we're now in the second stage, which is the public hearings. As you know, the public hearings are going on now. They'll be concluded probably in a couple of weeks. When they are concluded, the Intelligence Committee, which is holding these hearings, will write a report. Presumably, they will recommend to the Judiciary Committee that the Judiciary Committee write articles of impeachment. Then the matter goes to the Judiciary Committee. They can hold another round of hearings under the resolution. I think it's probable that they won't, that they'll go right about the business of writing the articles of impeachment, and then they'll go to the House floor, and the floor will pass them. So that's all a neat story. That's about where the neat story ends, because when you get to the United States Senate, when you start looking at Senate rules and procedures, often they tell you there's less they tell you about what's going to happen specifically than what they don't tell you, or the questions that they leave open. And this is no exception. There's lots of speculation. Will the Senate, for a while, the question was, will the Senate even hold a trial? Mitch McConnell, the majority leader, already says, he said publicly in a number of places, that he can't imagine the Senate removing the president. There's been a fair amount of speculation about whether the Republicans would just come in and move to dismiss the case, and do that by a majority vote and just bring the thing to a quick end. Now, the Senate does have a set of rules for impeachments. There are 26 rules. Again, there are lots of holes. It's very difficult to say anything very certain about how the procedure will unfold. As I read those rules, and I want to underline that this is my interpretation, a motion to dismiss the case is not in order. Now, you know that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court will be the presiding officer when the Senate sits on a trial of either the president or the vice president. The Chief Justice is the presiding officer. So I don't know whether John Roberts has read the rules as carefully as I have, and whether he'll agree with me or not. But what the rules say is, first of all, they say that if the House sends over articles of impeachment, the Senate must have a trial. And Mitch McConnell's finally acknowledged that much. What it goes on to say is once those articles of impeachment are presented to the Senate will deliberate 6 days a week, Sunday excluded, unless they decide to change that, which is true of all of these rules, which is why I say it's hard to know exactly what's going to happen. But then that rule goes on to say they'll meet 6 days a week until judgment is rendered. Now, I read that phrase, judgment is rendered, as indicating that there must be an up or down vote on guilt or not guilty. And we'll see if, that may not occur. If it does occur, we'll see how the Chief Justice rules. The Chief Justice would be expected to follow the recommendation of the Senate parliamentarian. That's generally what happens in the Senate. The Senate, by its nature, has a very weak presiding officer, always. They made sure of that right from the very first Congress. They didn't want John Adams, who was the vice president, to come over from the executive branch and take control of the Senate and run things. So they left the presiding officer in the Senate very weak, not at all like the Speaker in the House. So as a result, the presiding officer, even in normal times, relies very heavily on the parliamentarian. And if you watch the Senate on C-SPAN 2, you know there's a second tier below where the presiding officer sits. On the far left, as you face it, is where the parliamentarian is. We now have the first woman parliamentarian in the history of the Senate. She sits in a chair that revolves, and anytime anything, watch for this during the trial, anytime anything of any importance happens, she swings around in that chair and she says word for word what the presiding officer should then say. Now, when Chief Justice Rehnquist was the presiding officer in the Clinton trial, he followed the parliamentarian's recommendations very closely. I mean, he is the Chief Justice of the United States. By the way, it's one of the things that amuses me. It says a lot about the Senate, that the Senate rules for impeachment require that the presiding officer, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, take an oath. And I find it kind of amusing that the oath that he takes as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is not sufficient for the Senate. They write their own oath, and he has to swear to it. So the question then will remain, you know, we'll see about John Roberts and how closely he follows the parliamentarian. And I'll end, I'll let you out of the weeds, out of the discussion of rules. I'll just end with a little story about the Chief Justice Rehnquist when he was the presiding officer. And it happens that the parliamentarian at the time, Bob Dove, is the co-sponsor of my filibuster book. And he told me a story about the Clinton impeachment. One day, his dad was in the gallery, come to see his son be the parliamentarian at this great historic moment. His dad was sitting up there in the gallery. And at an important point in the deliberations, Rehnquist had to make a ruling. And in a stage whisper that could be heard throughout the chamber, as the parliamentarian swiveled around, Rehnquist looked at him and said, "What the hell do I do now?" So I don't know if we'll hear that from Roberts, but it'll be something to watch.
Well, thank you. And before we turn the floor to Eric, I just have one question. When you spoke with us last spring about your new book, you talked with us about the weaponization of procedures. Do you see examples here in the current context of procedures being weaponized or not so
Well,
much?
some would say, certainly the Trump defenders, some would say the impeachment procedure itself is being weaponized. And that, in fact, they do. I mean, that's the main argument that they're making. You know, they for the most part, they're not addressing the charges at all. The main argument that they're making is that the Democrats just want to pull down the president because they don't think they can beat him at the ballot box in 2020. And so they see this as, you know, the Democrats taking this procedure out of the Constitution and using it as a weapon against President Trump. But you know, when things are as polarized as they are in the current environment, that's a self-reinforcing process because each party responds to the other party with an even greater outrage. And so as we look at the terrain as it exists right now in Washington, we've seen many of the rules, procedures, mores, traditions of both the House and the Senate, but I spent most of my time in the Senate, so I'm particularly concerned about it, and I think it's very difficult times right now in terms of this question of being able to rise above the rank partisanship that we so often see, especially in the other body.
And so now let's turn to Professor Patashnik for some thoughts on policy implications.
Great. So my charge is to talk about the impact of impeachment on policymaking for 2020 and if Trump wins re-election, his second term. I think the latter question is much more important, but let's first dispose with the former. The Senate is likely to hold the impeachment trial in January. It's going to be all-consuming, and Congress is not going to have the bandwidth to pass many laws next year beyond must-pass spending bills. The reality, however, though, is that 2020 was already shaping up to be a pretty unproductive year, whether impeachment was on the agenda or not. Indeed, the current Congress, the 116th Congress, is on the path to being one of the least active in history. Congress has passed just 68 bills so far, compared with an average of 417 for each of the past 10 two-year Congresses. Now, to some degree, though, that comparison is a little misleading because Congress increasingly passes bills through large omnibus measures, whereas in the past, they might have had 5 bills separate with separate votes. Now they kind of glom them all together. And so that is a change. But while Congress has been doing more than many people realize, it has been making a lot of progress on major issues. A highly divisive impeachment trial in the Senate, in which Democrats and Republicans are at each other's throats, is not going to make it easier for Congress to work out compromises on issues like drug pricing. But the prospects for that were already dim anyway. The main factors that shape the quantity of policymaking on Capitol Hill are whether control of government is partisan control of government is unified or divided, the extent of polarization, the public mood, and interest group pressure. Given the configuration of these political forces today, we should not expect to see much action on critical issues. On the other hand, and I think this is important keeping in mind historically, when the political climate is conducive to policy activity, impeachment doesn't necessarily stand in the way. House hearings on impeachment in 1973 didn't stop the 93rd Congress from passing 772 bills, including major important legislation such as the War Powers Act, the 1974 Congressional Budget and Impoundment Act, and campaign finance legislation. If anything, at that time, the focus on presidential abuse of power gave energy to Congress's reform thrust. And so at the time, impeachment and lawmaking were reinforcing each other. If that were happening now, what you would be seeing would be Congress, for example, passing new protections for whistleblowers or finding ways of responding to the very abuses that are at the heart of impeachment. We're not seeing that because polarization is just too great. Similarly, in the past, Congress passed key Reconstruction laws while Andrew Johnson was being impeached. So, and the Congress that impeached Bill Clinton was also fairly productive in terms of policymaking. As Yale political scientist David Mayu writes, nothing prevents Congress from legislating and investigating with great strenuousness at the same time, or as Speaker Nancy Pelosi likes to put it, Congress can walk and chew gum. But members have to be willing and able to multitask, and right now, given the configuration of political forces, they just aren't. So the big issue isn't what happens in 2020, it's what happens in 2021 and after if Trump is reelected. I'll leave it to Wendy to say a lot more about the probability of Trump winning after impeachment and acquittal, but I certainly think it's well within the realm of possibility, especially if the Democrats nominated a candidate whose swing voters in battleground states like Arizona, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin find unacceptable. So assume for the moment that Trump is impeached on the House on a party line vote, acquitted in the Senate on a near party line vote, and again ekes out an electoral college victory while losing the popular vote. What does a second Trump term look like? To answer that question, it helps first to ask another question, and I actually think it's the most important question, and that is, will the GOP remain the party of Trump? Trump's approval rating among Republicans and Republican-leaning independents right now is 87%. Trump's approval nationally overall is not terribly high, but it's important to keep in mind that among Republicans, Trump is still quite popular. By contrast, Richard Nixon's support among Republicans averaged 52%. Now, if the stain of impeachment were to cause Trump's standing with the GOP voters to slip, if supporting Trump became an electoral liability for Republican members of Congress, then his influence over the policy agenda would decline. We might see some Republican office holders more willing to push back on Trump's stance on issues like immigration and trade, become more open to at least considering deals, bipartisan deals with Democrats on some issues. We could see a different dynamic than we've seen the last several years. So far, however, Trump's political base has remained solid. Only 19% of Republicans in a new 538 poll said they think Trump has committed an impeachable offense. Nixon had some ardent defenders. It's important to keep in mind, Nixon had a lot of Republicans that absolutely thought that he should remain in office. But what he didn't have is today's polarized environment. What he didn't have was Fox News, was a media environment and a conversation in which people are in different worlds. I can't speak for my colleagues, I was a weird, nerdy 9-year-old kid. I remember watching the Watergate hearings. It is one of my first memories, going home after school every day and watching Nixon on the hearings about Watergate. But at that time, there were like 3 TV channels. Everyone watched the same show. So it wasn't that Republicans got one message and Democrats got another. The whole country was seeing the same thing. Things have changed so much. Republicans in Congress have challenged Trump occasionally on policy, such as withdrawal of troops from Syria, but a combination of ideological agreement and especially, and this is a big change from the Nixon era, fear of primary challenges has made them reluctant to side against Trump on salient issues that are important to Republican voters. To be sure, Republicans are worried about the recent losses in state races in Virginia, Kentucky, and Louisiana, and these are bad omens for the future of the Republican Party. But if Trump is reelected and Republicans keep the Senate, it's likely that the current dynamic will continue. The GOP will remain Trump's party, at least until demographic change and generational replacement result in even bigger losses at the ballot box. So the policy impact of a second Trump term might be even more consequential and more durable than the first. Ruth Bader Ginsburg will be 87. Stephen Breyer will be 82 when a second Trump term begins. I know they exercise. I know they eat their bran. But these people cannot go on forever. If they were replaced by conservatives, the Supreme Court would have a 7-2 majority. The difference between a 7-2 majority and a 5-4 court is tremendous. A 5-4 court, you might lose a conservative here or that for some idiosyncratic reason, and they have to live with one another, and so there's some desire to maintain a level of comedy. If you've got a 7-2 conservative court, you're just going to push through a conservative agenda. As Princeton sociologist Paul Starr noted in an Atlantic essay on a second Trump term, while the focus has been on what a conservative court might mean for issues like Roe v. Wade, the really big shift, he thinks, and I quite agree with him, could involve an effort to undercut the Commerce Clause, which provides the foundation for a great deal of federal lawmaking, from labor standards to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to health and environmental regulation. Some conservative justices want to return to a pre-New Deal type of political regime, sharply limiting the scope of federal action, federal regulatory policies. They believe the modern activist state was fundamentally flawed, that the American regime is supposed to be locally based, that most policymaking is supposed to be at the state and local level, and that the great tremendous growth of the federal state that we've seen beginning in the progressive era, but especially since the New Deal, is not on solid constitutional moorings. And they want to turn things back to the way they believe it should be in many areas. So even if the Democrats were able to get in the future, pass legislation to tackle things like climate change, could be overturned if the court returns to a narrower interpretation of the Commerce Clause. If we're in a second Trump term, we're going to see continued efforts by Trump to use executive authority to pursue a deregulatory agenda through rulemaking, guidance, and policy revocation in areas such as health, labor, and the environment. Now, many of these changes, if they're through executive orders and the like, could be reversed by a future administration. That's why lawmaking is more important than executive action. But those kinds of actions will change the status quo point, and they will put proponents of activist government on the defensive, making it harder for them to advance their agenda. Perhaps the most durable changes might be in the foreign policy realm. while the so-called axis of adults, former Secretary of Defense James Mattis, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, National Security Advisor McMaster, and even John Bolton are no longer at the foreign policy table, Trump may be increasingly likely to follow his disruptive instincts. The American-led international order may continue to weaken with the abandonment of an American role in international organizations, more tariffs and trade wars, and more tweets that undercut allies and discourage career foreign services officers from calling out corruption and irregularities. Barack Obama famously said that President Trump is a symptom, not a cause of our political division. And I think that's true enough, but a second Trump term would be highly consequential. It would entrench shifts in partisan coalitions, in America's place in the world, and in the constitutional foundation of the federal role in the economy.
Thank you. And on that point of, perhaps moving to more subnational action, I'm wondering, given that Congress isn't doing much, is the current policy implication of the proceedings more action happening now already at the subnational level, as well as more action happening through executive branch executive orders? Or is it like policy stasis in multiple kinds of venues?
Yeah, that's the big question. Typically, we think of American democracy as having self-correcting mechanisms. That if action becomes too liberal, then there are forces that cause it to be more conservative, in like a thermostat. And we've often thought of the states and localities as being a balance of what's happening at the federal government. And that's really, I think, one of the big questions. We are seeing that in some areas, like even combating income inequality. We've seen some states adopt policies that are anti-poverty. We've seen some action increasingly in Medicaid policy. But at the same time, we are also seeing some of the national polarization spill over into the states. And so that is going to be a really big question in the years ahead. Will the states and localities that are more pragmatic, that are more responsive to public opinion, have an incentive to craft bipartisan legislation? Or will we see, as we're beginning to see in states like Wisconsin, for example, really, brass knuckles fighting, where we're seeing one party even change the rules of the game to try to entrench their side and make it harder for the other side to legislate, even if they win elections. And I think that's something to watch in the years ahead.
And now, speaking of elections, let's turn to Professor Wendy Schiller.
Okay, good evening. So I don't know, I feel like it's very quiet in this room. So, okay, I'm basically want to give you sort of a guide to what to do about, how to survive the next year and what to be looking for in the elections. So I'll basically that's stay calm and breathe and survive. So I want to talk a little bit about painting a different picture of politics as we stand right now, and I'm going to take off my watch so I can keep track of time, and then talk about the effect of impeachment, sort of a micro level, which is to say, don't discount the power, literally, of increased voter turnout. We saw in 2016 that Hillary Clinton received more popular vote. Donald Trump won the Electoral College. We've seen some changes politically in some of the states that Donald Trump won. Michigan has a Democratic governor, a woman, replacing a Republican man. Wisconsin has a Democratic man replacing a Democratic man. And North Carolina has a Democratic man replacing a Republican man. So you saw some changes already. And then we, of course, had the highest midterm turnout since 1974, which is traditionally called the post-Watergate baby year. About 118 million people voted in 2018, and 138 million people voted in the presidential election in 2016. So that turnout was about 50.4%, which is enormously high. In 2014, the midterm election turnout was 37%. So what did it achieve? In this age of significant doom and gloom, if you would have the panel persuade you, it's pretty gloomy. It wasn't gloomy at all if you're somebody who believes in what you would think is greater diversity and representation and greater mobility in terms of electing new people to Congress. So in particular, at the federal level in the House, there are, and I brought my cheat sheet on numbers, there are 127 women in the House of Representatives now. 127 women in 2019 as a result of those elections. And when I was your age, or actually a little bit older, and I graduated college and I went to Washington to work in the United States Senate, there were 23 women in the House of Representatives. And that was basically 1987, 1986, 87. That's a phenomenal increase. There are 47 women of color, a historic high in the House of Representatives. There are 25 women in the United States Senate. When I got to the Senate, there were 2. They were both Republican when I landed in the Senate in 1986. The first Democratic female senator was Barbara Mikulski, who turned out to be the longest-serving female senator. She just retired. She's from Maryland. The point is, now there are 25. Should there be 51 to be in accordance with the population distribution? One might say yes, one might say no. But the point is that social movements and policy movements and voter mobilization happen both because of political parties, and in spite of political parties. Happen because of government and in spite of government. And the society moves forward frequently, if not always, faster than political parties adjust. So where you may see political parties as not responsive to what you need, part of your job, part of our job, is to move those parties in a direction where you think that they will better represent and serve your interests. So don't walk out of the room thinking all is lost, we can't fix it or change it, we can't get what we need. Because what 2018 proved was, after losing an election, the progressive Democratic side did much, much better. That is typical in a midterm election. Presidents lose seats, but typically the president's party doesn't lose 40 seats, which is what happened in 2018. So think about that as you're going forward. For impeachment, will it affect Donald Trump's reelection prospects considerably? The answer is no. May it affect his reelection prospects on the margins? Yes. And here's the problem. Everything is a matter of margin. How many people have taken that required, research methods class in political science? The margin of error is typically about 3% in any pretty good poll. And what that means is it could be 3% higher, 3 percentage points lower. Right now, the feelings on impeachment are statistically essentially tied. Maybe a slight edge to the Democrats on impeachment, but not really. The country is completely divided, statistically divided. Sort of exactly like the polling was for Al Gore and George W. Bush in 2000, completely divided. So when you think about that, how do you move the needle? How do you beat an incumbent? They're hard to beat. How do you defeat that? Well, the only sort of unmeasurable factor is what I would call either Trump or sort of controversy fatigue. The question is, and if some of you recall back to 2016, the reason that a lot of Hillary Clinton supporters were so angry with James Comey and releasing the information about starting up an investigation that within 4 days was proven to be not worth investigating, the point of that was it made people believe that if Hillary Clinton were elected, it would be nonstop investigations. Because people who were old enough to remember the Clinton administration remembered that and thought, we want a fresh start, we want change, we don't want investigation after investigation after investigation. And there was a part of that turned off independent voters, you could argue. With Trump, the question mark is, will there be enough Trump fatigue? Do we really want 4 more years of investigations? The House will stay Democratic. The Senate is more up in the air than we thought. But the point is, do you really want more of that, or can't we find somebody else? And that's a very small percentage of voters to move. But they're significant and consequential. And in fact, except they don't live in the South. If you look at the impeachment polling, the South is pretty phenomenally against impeachment for the president. But the rest of the regions, particularly the Midwest, are much more up for grabs than they were. So the question is, do people say, I'm going to stay home, I'm not going to vote, I just don't want to deal with it, wake me up and tell me what happens? Or are they going to basically get out and say, we just can't take 4 more years? And that, nobody knows. Because nobody knows what that fatigue will feel like a year from now. You don't know. Will the economy be great? Will the economy be not so great? Other things can overtake this election. So that's where I think politically the Democrats are figuring that if they can move the needle among independents slightly on election day a year from now. Remember, if you're a sports fan, we're in the first quarter of a football game. We are nowhere near the fourth quarter. So remember that. Think about that. The second thing where I think it makes a difference is the Senate, and here's why. The Senate now has 23, the Republicans have 23 seats to defend. There'll be a special election in Georgia in December, bless you, because Johnny Isaacson retiring. So we have 4 Republicans retiring, and we have 23 GOP seats to defend. There are 12 Democratic-held seats to defend and only 1 Democrat retiring. The states to watch are also swing states. So Arizona, Martha McSally, North Carolina, Tom Tillis, Colorado, which some people can argue may be already blue, Cory Gardner, and Susan Collins in Maine. And those 4 races are going to be hotly contested. They are neck and neck already, and it is unclear how they will turn out. So, Arizona could go blue, Colorado could go blue, Maine can stay as it is, but North Carolina, particularly if there's an African-American turnout. Bill Clinton won North Carolina the first time he won president. Barack Obama won North Carolina the first time he ran for president. So when you think about that and you think about the Democratic nomination process, what the Democrats are doing to put pressure on the Senate on impeachment are those 4 senators. Those 4 incumbent senators running for re-election. What will they do? And how will that play with independents in their states? And so there is more uncertainty about the Senate, holding the Senate, because impeachment puts this additional pressure on those senators than we had a couple of months ago before impeachment. So that, to me, it's not to help the House Democrats. Republicans are leaving the House still in pretty big numbers. The Democrats are going to keep the House. It's the Senate. And this gives them, theoretically, another piece of ammunition in some of those very hotly contested races. So I think that's the general direct impact of impeachment. This will be the 3rd impeachment in pretty much a generation, 60 years. So you're getting to where this is weaponized. But, nobody impeached George W. Bush. Nobody impeached Barack Obama. There are ways to be president for 8 years or 4 years and not get impeached. So it's not like it's automatic. You need to give some people some evidence to impeach you. So that's where I see it is. And people will take this into account. It may not be their most important issue. It may not be their least important issue. But it will be part of this general fatigue that we have with politics today. And it will take a lot of positive energy, I would argue, by Donald Trump to overcome that sense of nagging doubt in independence to avoid losing any votes over this.
So one question before we turn it to the audience. If we look within parties for a moment instead of between parties, do you see the impeachment proceedings as helping or hurting party moderates or helping hurting party partisans?
Well, it absolutely helps the party organization mobilize their base. So the Republicans are mobilizing around it to defend the president, and the Democrats are mobilizing and pretty successfully mobilizing their base around it. For moderates, too, as Rich mentioned, 2 moderates voted against doing this in the House, but the Democrats picked up 40 seats. So even if they lose those 2 moderate-held seats, they still are up, and they're still going to keep the House. So I don't see this as damaging the party in any way. As I say, I think it's going to come down to individual explanations by these incumbent senators in their parties and whether they are challenged in the primary. Remember, the timing of the primaries goes from January all the way to June for the United States Senate. Mike Pompeo doesn't have to declare even running for Senate in Kansas till June of 2020. So Republicans in the Senate are worried about a primary, and that worry stays live for 6 months. And that gives core partisans in the Senate on both sides, particularly Republican side, a lot of power over how they treat this impeachment proceeding.
So we're going to take your questions. Please line up at the microphones. We will alternate between microphones. We are a full house tonight, which is great, but that invites us all to be mindful of our airtime. If you could ask one direct question and then share the microphone with your colleague, that would be great. Do the panelists want to ask any questions or respond to each other's comments while we wait for questions at the mic?
And I thought all these were fascinating. There's lots to say, but I'll just follow up on what Wendy said, that 127 women, which is really striking. The other striking thing is 117 of them are Democrats. Or to put it in other terms, the Republican Party in the House is 89% white male. The Democratic Party in the House, 39% white male. So we've got amazing changes afoot, which is just part of what Wendy was just saying, but very powerful and unprecedented stuff going on. All right, that's enough of filibuster. You guys have questions. There you are.
Hi, my name's Alyssa. I know most of you. I wanted to talk about something that Professor Patashnik brought up, which is in some of these places, Republicans are changing legislation so that even if Democrats were elected, they would be ineffective. So I was wondering if you could think about or talk about, let's say Trump gets reelected, or things continue as they are. What does the future of policymaking look like in places where legislation is enshrined that prevents progressive legislation or bipartisan legislation from happening? Does that make sense?
Important question.
It does. And I mentioned in my remarks Paul Starr, who's a sociologist at Princeton. He has a new book actually just on this question called Entrenchment. And he looks through history and argues that a lot of policymaking typically are just, we move in this direction and this is the program that we have, and then the other party gets elected and they, move in another direction. But at some times in history, there are efforts to structure the underlying rules of the game in ways that are going to make changes more durable and harder to undo. And he argues that we're seeing a lot of that now. And I think it's one factor that was alluded to that's driving this entrenchment politics is not only are we polarized, but the two parties are, as Wendy suggested, we're so evenly matched. The country is so closely divided. Every election, almost could go one way or the other. And given those incentives, everybody is looking for an advantage to sort of put a little thumb on the scale to make it more likely that your party's achievements will last, even if you lose power. And we're seeing that, I think, quite blatantly in Wisconsin, for example, where an effort by one party to actually reduce the authority of the governor, to reduce...
The lame duck, is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, they're changing the appointment power. They're changing, the legislature is shifting power from the executive to the legislature in ways that are very different. And I think we may, and it will play out differently in different places, but one reason that can be successful is the public sort of tunes out on these procedural issues. They pay attention to healthcare, or they pay attention to, the environment, but they might not pay attention to what if this party is weakening the appointment power of the governor, and that's going to make it harder for her to achieve her agenda, even if her party wins. And so I think those kinds of institutional rules of the game really require close attention from people who pay attention to politics.
Just a point on that policy change. If you look at the Louisiana governor's race, and the Louisiana governor, Democrat, just won re-election by 40,000 votes. So in Kentucky, it was 5,400 votes, but in Louisiana, it was 40,000. And one of the things that people attribute to his victory is the expansion of healthcare availability through Medicaid expansion in Louisiana. And in Kentucky, the father of the current governor, now the governor-elect, Andy Beshear's father, Stephen Beshear, he expanded Medicaid in Kentucky through the Obamacare program, the Affordable Care Act. So what you're seeing, and Arizona, a Republican governor expanded Medicaid. So when you see that there is an actual, and West Virginia, this is another one, is very Republican controlled, but also expanded Medicaid. So in spite of polarization and partisanship, when there is a program and policy that serves constituents, that provides an actual service that they can identify, they want it and they want to keep it. And then you'll see there'll be challenges to it. But that's what, Eric, I think that's what you're talking about in terms of lasting benefits. That was the Republicans' fear, and Professor Morone can talk about this now if you want to pick this up on Medicare. In the 1960s, they passed Medicare, and the Republicans tried to kill it for a decade, and they couldn't do it. But it took a while for it to solidify, and that's what you have to think about in your generation. What are the things you think people generally take for granted, but if you told them they'll be taking them away, would they mobilize and say, don't take it away? And that's what we've been seeing in some of these very deep South, very Republican-controlled states. So that's what the Democrats have to pay attention to. What will people fight for to keep? and what do they basically are indifferent to? And I don't know that there's that much attention being paid in the Democratic Party to those distinctions.
Yeah, just to add one thing to that, you know, it'll be really interesting to look back, 10 years from now, remember this moment, because we'll know stuff that we don't know now. So we might see this as a moment, and this follows directly from what you just said, we might see this as the last gasp of an old white party hanging on to power. And we've got a million new voters coming on every year. Half of them are millennials, 70% Democratic. Half of them are people who have been naturalized, 70% Democratic. The numbers are changing very dramatically. If we ran the election of 2016 today, in 2020, and every demographic voted exactly the way they did last time, Trump loses because of the new voters who've come in. Oh, and by the way, the old white voters who died. So things are changing. We may look back on the Trump era and simply say, oh, that was the last gasp. So if you're a Republican in the room thinking, oh my God, how did I wander into this liberal cry fest? You've got a challenge in front of you. And the challenge is really clear. It's in the numbers that Wendy mentioned earlier, which is what the demographics are. If you're a young Republican, your job is to go out and find groups that Trump is driving away from the party. Because the Republican Party you can fight the rules, you can change the rules, you can only hang on so long if the majority keeps getting larger against you. So the Republican job is real easy. Find a way to appeal to voters that you once had. The Asian vote was once dominated by Republicans till the year 2000. So that's pretty recently. Latino vote, pretty strong Republican. African American vote, strong Republican back before the 30s. Republicans, if they don't go get those, we're going to be looking back on this moment as sort of the last gasp of a dying party. Now, could go lots of different ways. Things always change. But to add to the non-gloom, the only hope for Republicans is not entrenchment in the long run, is not biasing the Supreme Court in the long run, because these programs are popular. It's speaking to a new constituency that Trump is not bothering to speak to. So that's my little message of hope.
And if you are in the college Republicans or young Republicans, climate change, if you look at the numbers in your demographic, Republicans under 40 are majority supportive of climate, of actions taken by government to forestall climate change. In other words, they're pro-environment. They may not be as big government pro-environment, but they're pro-environment. So some of the demographics that on millennials, there's a lot of room for moderates, conservatives, libertarians to get more sway amongst younger voters, depending on what those issues are.
Thank you.
So I've got a question. I'm Nancy Kirsch. I freelance write for you guys, but I'm here as just a regular person today. So if someone could talk both about concerns about voter suppression, and I think Professor Patashnik talked about how this is a pretty do-nothing Congress. How much of that is because Mitch McConnell is simply putting forth no legislation other than, let's rubber stamp those judges, let's rubber stamp those judges? How much of that do you attribute to his inaction? So 2 questions. I know I wasn't supposed to.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think you can lay a lot of this to Mitch McConnell's control of the Senate. I was thinking as we were going through our little period of painting a rosier picture, I was thinking of what Eric said earlier about the Senate and the confirmation of judges. And of course, talk about chewing gum and walking at the same time. The Republicans are chewing gum and sprinting at the same time. They are confirming judges at a record pace. And those new Trump judges are more conservative, whiter, more male, and younger than previously, going back, I think, probably to Reagan. And so, and of course, you know, when you're putting people on the federal bench at age 36 and 37 for life, you know, they can wait out a whole lot of change.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, Trump has named 1 out of 4 federal judges, more than Obama did in 8 years, in 2 years. So there's no question about that.
So I think one of the things that makes politics so fascinating is that maintaining partisan coalitions is really hard because the world is changing. Demographic forces bring new voters in and old voters leave. And so if you're the Republican Party, Jim was talking and Wendy was talking about some of their weaknesses. They are very weak with younger voters. I would not want to be the Republican Party and thinking about how I'm going to maintain this coalition going forward. Wendy's exactly right. If you look at a range of issues, they're out of step where even some younger Republicans are, and they're out of step on gun control and some other issues with suburban voters. On the other hand, they've so far been successful at maintaining a coalition with a lot of skill. They've done it because who is the core Republican coalition? Evangelicals in the South who care deeply about court nominations. And so Mitch McConnell has made sure that that is a priority. The wealthy Republican donor base, the elite, wants tax cuts above all, and they've delivered that. And then many Republicans are very uncomfortable with some of the social changes that we're seeing in the country. They don't like what they perceive as political correctness or a change in their status. And the rhetoric of the Republican Party has said to them, we're on your side. And so they've managed a very diverse coalition of ordinary Americans who identify with the Republican Party and are uncomfortable with social change, who are evangelicals who care about justices and Supreme Court nominations, and a business elite that cares about tax cuts. That's how they've been able to hold power so far. They've gotten into trouble with issues like pre-existing conditions, for example, where they just tie themselves into knots because there's just no way they can deliver a policy that works for Americans that's popular. They just can't find a way of doing it, and so they have to try to get that off the agenda. But this will become increasingly hard. Democrats so far have managed a coalition that includes more educated folks, people in urban areas, more diverse coalition, but they've also had trouble holding on to power for people that want programs, but they're skeptical of government. They don't trust government. They think the government wastes money. They don't want to see taxes go up. So how do they reconcile these things? We see this with the struggle on Medicare for all. How do you promise a bill that will satisfy people, but also not scare people away? So both parties have strengths, but both parties also face dilemmas in maintaining their coalitions.
One very quick
Then we'll take some more
word.
questions.
In 1800, there were 17 states. 6 of them changed the rules for the election of 1800, the first contested election, and we've been changing the rules and messing with the rules ever since. If I had just one reform to propose, it would be to make sure there was a right to vote for everyone, not without a whole lot of rigmarole and baloney. But that's been a battle in the United States every election. We've always played with that, and it's part of a democratic suppressing gene that runs through American history, and something to worry about. You're right.
Excuse me. Hi. I've recently written a paper actually for Professor Arenberg's class surrounding impeachment.
What did he
so-
get?
We don't know yet.
Hey,
Um,
obviously.
obviously.
And so I spent a lot of time going through the entire history of impeachment, which obviously there isn't a lot with presidents, but there have been with judges. And I spent a lot of time reading Federalist 65 and going through that. And basically what I discovered was that there are 2 essential philosophies surrounding impeachment. There's the philosophy that impeachment should be used when somebody has failed to hold up to some objective standard and they've failed to reach that. And then there's the other philosophy that they have not satisfied their constituency. And I think based on which philosophy you go with, you could come out with very different ideas of this current impeachment proceeding. And so I'm curious to hear from you guys what your thoughts are on what the proper or at least constitutionally accurate way of going about impeachment is.
I'll just start really quickly. There's nothing constitutionally accurate because there's very little guidance in this document.
Very vague, yes.
So, I mean, I think that's where I'll just start the conversation. The founders, they were most concerned with people being personally corrupted through personal financial corruption and being corrupted by foreign influences. That's what they were worried about in the very beginning. Just going to leave it at that. So I think that's what they were worried about. And they were worried about it because it could break apart the country, literally undermine the national security of the country. So when you think about what rises to level of impeachable offense, you can sort of fight about policy disagreements. If Congress is telling the president to do something, they won't do it. Or Richard Nixon covering up something, a crime, Bill Clinton lying under oath. And then you have Donald Trump. And what the Democrats are saying is that when it goes to the core of what the founders are worried about in terms of impeachment, they are making the accusation that he has committed the very offenses that the founders worried about the most when they created the impeachment power. That's what their argument is.
Just one more quick word about that. It's a mistake to see the founders in sort of our litigious terms. What they really put in the Constitution is use your judgment. You know, it's really just make your judgment. Is this man or woman someday, should they be removed because they've violated what the office ought to be? And we're not comfortable with that. We want rules and regulations in our society. We need them. But they had a different view, which is, again, use your judgment. So it's really what their judgment is.
That's why they put high crimes in there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Definitely a tough question to follow up on. I wanted to ask Professor Schiller, you spoke of how this impeachment proceedings is going to affect Donald Trump's general election campaign. But how's it going to affect someone like Joe Biden, who's a scandal that there is some legitimacy to has not been brought to national spotlight until the impeachment proceedings?
Well, it's interesting that you say there's a scandal that there's some legitimacy to. So far, there's no evidence that the vice president did anything wrong. Whether his son was engaged in peddling influence or selling influence that didn't actually exist, sort of getting paid to sit on the Ukrainian board and promising things that he was never going to be able to deliver, that's a different story. And I agree with you that that is something that we probably all want to get to the bottom of. But there's no current evidence at all. In today's impeachment hearings in the second round of testimony late in the day, Kurt Volker says, I've known Biden forever. It never occurred to me that he would ever exercise influence improperly. So it's interesting. You would think this would hurt Biden, and I think that it did for a little time in the Democratic primary process. It hurt him because people said, "Oh, we don't want a tarnished candidate." This whole worrying about Hillary again losing. But now, given that there's sort of frequent testimony saying there was absolutely no evidence that the vice president did anything, and these are people who worked in the Trump administration saying that, I think in some ways he's got a little more juice back, a little more momentum. But I agree with you that until we know exactly why Hunter Biden was paid a certain amount of money every month to sit on a Ukrainian gas company board or any other company, a foreign company, then there's going to be some sort of lingering suspicion that maybe Hunter did something wrong. And that, you're well before you were born, Jimmy Carter had a brother named Billy who was a problematic sibling. Problematic. And everyone's like, oh, Billy. And Bill Clinton, and Hillary Clinton, they had some relatives, maybe some problematic people. So it can hurt you. There's no question about it. And I think that in the Democratic Party, he's looking better. But there's a little bit of a sense of, is there another shoe that will drop? So I think you're honing in on a pretty important point.
There's just one more point, and that's the Bernie point, the Bernie Elizabeth Warren point. And that is, to what extent are people in the Democratic Party kind of sick of elite, wealthy politics? That burned Hillary, and probably not enough to make her lose, but the sort of big money connections. So insofar as you're a Bernie person, it's not that he did anything wrong, it's just the kind of influence that's being peddled. So I think that's another thing to keep an eye on for the left.
Thank you.
My question is, what, if any, influence you think all of this will have on the 2020 census and the redistricting process that's coming up after the recent election?
Well, Virginia. I would just say that it makes state elections incredibly important in 2020. You can make the argument that the state elections the elections at the state level in 2020 are far more important than the federal. Right? Because of now, Virginia will have a unified Democratic governor going into census redrawing. So Virginia's already bluish. It's going to go deep blue. It's going to go dark blue, right, after that. So yes, gerrymandering, census line drawing, taking the census at all and doing a good job with it, I think certainly a Trump victory might affect the interpretation of those results. But states redistrict. The state governments redistrict. The federal government doesn't do that. So state elections will be vitally important on that score. And I hope that doesn't get overlooked going to 2020.
Thanks.
So we've touched on this some in the answers to the questions that we've heard, but just in terms of like the actual content of what this impeachment is about, we don't have any interns, we don't have Monica Lewinsky around, so I'm just curious whether the fact that this is a foreign policy question, that it's about Ukraine, that you got a lot of long last names in there, how much that's going to affect public interest in this impeachment, even aside from the changes like in polarization that we're seeing, if the actual content of the impeachment is going to make a difference.
I think that's a fantastic question. I watched a little bit of it this morning, and then I watched a little bit of it this afternoon. Not much, though. I was actually not watching. I was listening. I was grading some papers. And I was listening, and it was so boring this morning, and I thought, nobody's going to watch or listen to this. It's so boring. Then this afternoon was really interesting and charismatic and captivating. So I wonder if certain clips will play better than others. But again, I'll go back to the general Trump fatigue. I think it's the idea that, people, this is like Tony Soprano. People understand what he did. He admitted what he did. The question is, do you think it's worth it to oust him from office? And I think most people might say, yeah, maybe not, but do we want this for another 4 years? So I'm not sure it matters that much that people don't know the details. It matters that it's about foreign policy and withholding aid to an ally, because that has a national security element to it. And if you're feeling that the president isn't on his game in terms of the world stage, national security-wise, this makes you more nervous.
And remember, as Wendy said earlier, it's very small margins of people that make all the difference. And I think the suburban, and there's evidence for this in the last election, just a few weeks ago, that the suburban voters really find this distressing, this giving up of allies and this particular Tony Soprano foreign policy. I was absolutely opposed to impeachment. I thought it would hurt the Democrats, and I was arguing and talking on the radio and trying to shut Corey Brettschneider up. But this was so obviously against the law. I mean, when you came out with that transcript, it was, I give up. And I've been struck at how little it's hurt them. And so I think, despite the fact that sometimes it's incredibly boring, it really does seem, for the suburban, educated person who went with Trump last time in the suburbs of Philadelphia, in the suburbs of Milwaukee, in the suburbs of some of the Texas cities, I think those people have really had enough. And I think the very topic that Tony Soprano foreign policy, that's easy to understand in a way all the details aren't. So I think the details don't matter. But I think this sort of and Giuliani looks, you just look at his picture, that's not a good poster boy. So I don't think the sort of implication that was one's first thought, well, who cares about the Ukraine? I don't think that's right for those marginal people.
Easy to understand, but they decided that the Latin quid pro quo was too complicated.
The problem for the Democrats is if Biden drops out early, if another nominee surges ahead, like Warren or Buttigieg or even Deval Patrick, if Biden goes away, then I think that starts to temper the power of this conversation, because he was trying to investigate Biden. So voters will say, well, Biden's gone, so what difference does it make?
Right.
So that's the only kind of turn this could take. If the Democrats don't get this done quickly, like before Iowa or before New Hampshire in February, then it becomes less salient if Biden's no longer a candidate. So that's the other side of that coin.
Next question.
Hi. So you talked a little bit about Joe Biden and that affecting the 2020 primary. My question was, what about like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, who are going to be in like the trial, like right before Iowa and during the early state nomination? Like, how is that going to affect them not being on the trail? Or like, how intensive is it? Like, are they going to be off the trail, or like, can they do both at the same time?
No, they're stuck. No, I think they're stuck. I mean, normally candidates who are in the Senate, they can kind of, they manage the flights and the time schedules and so forth and so on. But this is unusual, because for an impeachment trial, you have to be there sitting at your desk. And you're going to be outed if you're not there. And so you can see what Liz Warren's already said. She was asked about it, and she says, it's constitutional responsibility. It's my first responsibility. If there's a trial, I'll be there. And I think all 6 of them are in that position. Some of them may be gone before we get to the trial, but I think they're, in that sense, they're trapped in Washington. And the Republicans are aware of that. You know, there's been some chatter. I don't take it very seriously, but there's been some chatter amongst Republicans that maybe they don't want a swift trial and get it over with. Maybe they want to drag it out and keep those Democrats in Washington.
So we have 5 minutes and 3 question askers. So we're going to do the lightning round of questions. If we could just get all 3 questions on the table, and then our panel can answer it as a group.
Wendy Schiller mentioned this earlier. I realized Trump at the time was not president, but is there no way to process the theft of election 2016 by the Trump-Comey abusive investigations of Clinton, so that essentially undermined her campaign?
And the next question?
So after Trump leaves office, whether that be after impeachment and removal or after the 2020 election or after 2024, where do you see the Republican Party going with their leadership? Do you expect a rebranding of the party after this presidency?
And last question.
Mine comes maybe from a place of youthful ignorance, because this is the only impeachment I've been alive for. But do you see this impeachment? I know, Professor Morone, you talked about the partisanship we've seen in past impeachments, but the kind of character critiques we're seeing, especially from the Republican congressmen and women, of the testifiers. Is this something that is new to this impeachment, or is this something we've seen in the past?
I mean, that sort of going after witnesses?
Yeah, and kind of going after their character and critiquing their credentials to be testified.
Comey, future of the Republican Party and character.
I'm going to lightning round answer, and then we'll all go down the road. Okay, I'm going to lightning round answer. So I think to the Russia investigation, I think what's also coming out now is the firm statements by witnesses that Ukraine did not interfere in our elections in 2016, that Russia did, and it keeps getting repeated. So whether that leaves the door open for some sort of investigation about the Hillary, the WikiLeaks, the Russia leaks, I think it might, because it keeps coming up over and again. The future of the Republican Party, I would argue, could start with Nikki Haley, and it could start with Nikki Haley in 2020. Trump could easily dump Pence and at the convention and say Nikki Haley is my ticket, and I think that would be a powerful ticket. I think people like Nikki Haley, or women like Nikki Haley, are probably the best hope for the Republican Party going down the line. And then on a character, Democrats did a pretty good character. They've done their own share of character assassinations. No, not just Lewinsky, but Robert Bork in the Supreme Court hearings in 1986 and 87. I think they have their own experience with it, so it's not new. John Tower for Secretary of Defense in 1989. They've done their own character assassination. This goes a little deeper to civil servants and bureaucrats, but both parties unfortunately do it.
Real quick, I completely agree with Wendy. I think the future of the Republican Party is Nikki Haley, and I think Nikki Haley has signaled that she thinks it's still Trump's party, and that she will soften the edges, soften the rhetoric, indicate that Trump's presentation was one that a lot of suburban voters were uncomfortable with, but he was on our side. And I don't see yet a fundamental challenge for the heart and soul of the Republican Party.
Okay, no, but the important question is whether 2020 looks like 2016 and whether we do anything about it. I think the future of the Republican Party is just one of those fascinating issues. It's deeper and further than just one person, and it's going to be a war. But what's most interesting to me is how the moderates in the Democratic Party, that small band, want to move to the Democrats, the moderates in the Republican Party. If you read the columnists, the conservative columnists in the Washington Post or the New York Times, they keep going out and finding conservatives. Then the party moves further, so they get another one. And these are all begging, please, no, whatever you do, not Warren. We could get behind a Joe Biden. So we might have a kind of shift where the Republican Party goes, well, the Democrats go for the moderates of both the Republican and the Democrats, and then you have a left wing sort of left out, the left and right wings left off. That's just to expand your mind. There's 1,000 different ways this could go. So that's the most fascinating question of all. You know, what's interesting is how they're arguing the process this time, that there was always some argument on the merits. And going back to the first impeachment, it was all about the merits. It was about the nature of African Americans and the role in society and whether you were really violated. So Democrats were arguing democratic theory about race, which was horrible and racist, but they had an argument. It was not this process sucks, which is I'm sorry, this process is infelicitous, which is what it is now. I think there was some of it, but not all of it. Sorry, we're gonna have to clean up the transcript. Sorry, Mr. Taubman, I apologize.
I think on the 2016 question that it strikes me, who would have thought that the best way to protect yourself against a scandal is to have more scandals and just keep them coming. And that's why the Democrats in the end have settled on the cleanest, most discreet example they could. And I think, there's a tendency to want them to now start building on it and bringing these other things in. Nancy Pelosi's too smart for that. And on the Republicans, I think the answer to that really lies in the outcome in 2020. I think if 4 years of Donald Trump is one thing, 8 years is an entirely different kettle of fish, and we're gonna, what's left of the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, what it looks like, and what our system looks like after 8 years. I think that will go a long way in answering your question.
Well, thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you to our panel.